In the history of the Canadian military, just once has a single unit had 3 soldiers receive the Victoria Cross, the highest honor a soldier in the Commonwealth can receive, in a single day. This happened during the first overseas conflict Canada was ever involved in, the Second Boer War, and the date that it happened was November 7th, 1900. It was the Battle of Leliefontein, also known as the Battle of Witkloof. The battle took place near what is now the reservoir created by the Nooitgedacht Dam, south of Belfast in South Africa. During a withdrawal of British and Canadian forces from the area, a rearguard of roughly 100 men fought off assaults from the Boers at the Komati River. First, some background on how Canadians even ended up in South Africa. The Second Boer War was fought between the British Empire and the independent Boer states of the Republic of Transvaal, or the South African Republic, and the Orange Free State. The war was ostensibly fought between the Boers and the British over who would control the lucrative Witwatersrand gold mines and other precious resource mining operations in the area. While the Boers and the British had clashed off and on over the course of a century, the British ultimately gained control of the land, although the Boers were upset with many parts of the British administration. This included the abolition of slavery in 1834. The 2 independent countries would be formed after migrating away from British rule during the Great Trek. However, British attempts to annex Transvaal in 1877 would lead to the First Boer War. The British would be defeated, and the 2 republics remained independent, albeit with some conditions, and this uneasy peace continued until 1899. Aggressive expansionism from the British Empire would result in rising tensions, and the 2 sides started negotiations over the rights of Uitlanders, primarily British, in Transvaal, the control of the gold mining industry in South Africa, as well as the British seeking to bring the 2 independent states under British control in a federation. Negotiations broke down in June of 1899. In October, an ultimatum from the president of Transvaal, Paul Kruger, to withdraw all troops from border areas between the Empire and the Boer states was rejected, and this resulted in the declaration of war. At the onset of the war, Canada was divided on involvement in the conflict. For English-speaking parts of the country, they were willing to go to war for the Empire. The French-speaking parts of the country, primarily Quebec, did not want their national sovereignty to be a continuation of British imperialism. Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier made a compromise, with 1,000 volunteers to assist the Empire being sent overseas. Ultimately, more than 7,000 Canadians would serve in a combat situation, with 270 men being killed in action. The war itself was fought primarily in 3 phases. The first saw the Boers winning a number of battles and gaining a strategic advantage. The second part of the war saw the Empire winning several battles. The soldiers from the Commonwealth also found themselves resorting to burning farms and using concentration camps to persuade the Boers to surrender. This ultimately ended with the signing of the Treaty of Vereeniging in 1902. Now, going back to the Battle of Leliefontein, a British-Canadian force was operating in the area around the Komati River, south of Belfast. They were looking to push Boer forces out of the area. And on November 6th, they encountered a group of Boers. However, the British were concerned about reinforcements and chose not to push the attack. The Boers were indeed linking up with reinforcements, and when they realized they were not being pursued, but rather the Commonwealth forces were withdrawing back to Belfast, they pushed on the attack. The Royal Canadian Dragoons, roughly 100 men, along with 2 field guns from the Canadian Field Artillery, were ordered to cover the withdrawal. The Canadians spread out along a roughly 5-kilometer line. The Boers would assault the Canadian position multiple times the morning of November 7th. A mounted force of 200 Boers would charge the line at one point, only to be repulsed by just a handful of Canadian soldiers. The Boers repeatedly tried to capture the field guns, as well as the Browning machine guns that the Canadians had, only to fail each time. Once was when Sergeant Edwards James Gibson Holland carried the machine gun himself, mounting a horse, all to prevent its capture. Now, during the attacks, 2 of the Boer commanders were killed and a 3rd injured, and this would have consequences later on in the engagement. The Canadians finally began to withdraw back towards the rest of the column, with a group of dragoons under Lieutenant Hamden Zane Churchill Coburn covering them. The assaults would start to wither due to a lack of structure and command due to the fallen commanders on the Boer side, and once the Canadians were on the high ground, the Boers halted their attacks. At the end of the engagement, the Canadians had 3 men killed in action and 11 more wounded. As a result of the actions, British Major General Horace Smith-Dorrien, the commander of the force, recommended that 4 of the soldiers be awarded the Victoria Cross for the efforts. Lieutenant Richard Ernest William Turner was recommended for and received the honor after he led a group of 12 men during the battle to prevent the capture of one of the 2 Canadian field guns. Holland's efforts to keep the machine gun from capture, as well as his leadership during the final stand before withdrawal, was also recognized with the Victoria Cross. Finally, Coburn, who was in charge of the dragoons who held their position to allow for the withdrawal of the rest of the unit, received the Victoria Cross as well. A 4th soldier who was recommended to receive recognition for his actions was Private W.A. Kinsley. However, he did not receive the Victoria Cross. The Distinguished Service Order was also presented to Lieutenant William Morrison for his efforts in leading the D Battery of the Canadian Field Artillery during the engagement. The actions of the dragoons were recognized in a letter to the British Chief of Staff from Smith Dorrien. In the letter, he wrote, "I have much pleasure in forwarding attached statements on the gallant behavior of officers and non-commissioned officers of the Royal Canadian Forces in the actions of 7th November 1900 between Witkloof and Leliefontein on the Komati River. I must, in bringing them forward, emphasize the fact that the behavior of the whole Canadian rearguard under Lieutenant Colonel Lessard was so fine that it makes it most difficult to single out for special distinction. There is no doubt that men sacrificed themselves in the most gallant way to save the guns, which they succeeded in doing." Turner would return to Canada after the war and stayed with the military. At the onset of World War I, he was promoted to Brigadier General and was in command of the 3rd Brigade of the 1st Division of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. He would be in charge of the Canadians who fought at the Ypres salient on April 17, 1915, which was the first time the Germans used chemical weapons on the Western Front. Turner would ultimately be relieved of field command in December 1915 and became commander of British forces in Britain and the Canadian government's chief military advisor. He passed away at the age of 89 on June 19, 1961. Holland returned to Canada after the war and became a commissioned officer. He was promoted to major and served in World War I in the Canadian Machine Gun Corps. He passed away on June 18, 1948 in Cobalt, Ontario. He was 70 years old. Coburn returned to Canada after the war and took up residence in Saskatchewan. There, in 1913, he died in a horse riding accident near Maple Creek. He was 45. Morrison was a journalist before the war, and after serving with the artillery in South Africa, he was promoted to Major General during World War I. He would be the man in command of all artillery during the Battle of Vimy Ridge. He died in Ottawa on May 28, 1925, at the age of 57. The Royal Canadian Dragoons is still an active unit in the Canadian Army. They are based at CFB Petawawa in Ontario and are part of 2 Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group. The unit features a springbok on the cap badge in honor of their service in the Second Boer War. The unit has a long history in the Canadian Army and received battle honors in the Northwest Rebellion, the Second Boer War, the Great War, the Second World War, and Afghanistan. As for the Boer War, generous terms were offered to the Boers to regain their support in 1899. An indemnity of £3 million was paid to the Boers by the British for reconstruction, with a promise of limited self-government. The treaty ended the South African Republic, or Transvaal, and the Orange Free State, and ultimately, in 1910, the Union of South Africa was established as a dominion of the British Empire.